Hey everyone, Christ is risen, and best wishes to you all on the feast tomorrow of the Holy God-crowned Kings and equals of the Apostles, Constantine and Helen. On the eve of commemorating this incredible feast day of this great king and his pious mother, I'd like to offer a reflection on civil disobedience. What is the Christian's relationship to the civil authority? We're a long way from the reign of Emperor Constantine and from the pious and right-believing kings and queens of Christian history. And even in our own nation, we're very far away from kind of the classic approach to civil authority that America was founded on and maintained for much of her history. So this question of civil disobedience is relevant, not just for the feast day of Saints Constantine and Helen, but especially for the recent developments that we have all been living through during this crisis of the coronavirus. Let me start by simply pointing out that the general disposition of Christians to the state, to the civil authority, is one of submission and humble obedience. This is the standard approach and disposition of heart and mind that Christians have towards the state. This is articulated clearly in our Savior's own life, even being willing to pay tax, to do to make no offense to the civil authorities. Think of St. Paul's teaching in Romans chapter 13, where he acknowledges at a time probably under the Emperor Nero, when the Roman Empire was governed by utter godlessness, he still was able to say that all authority is established by God. And those who resist the authority resist God. Wow. Think of also 1 Peter 2 as another good example about the responsibility of Christians towards the state to be obedient, That's our general disposition. And it's important to say, at times like these, when we have a lot of outbreak of lawlessness and a lot of theories and conspiracy theories swirling everywhere, and many people certain that they can have the secret knowledge that other people don't have about what's really going on, it's important to remember that our general disposition, even to those governments which are not upright, is one of humble submission. This is the Christian attitude. Are there limits to our obedience? And if there are, what are those limits? The answer is yes. There are limits to our obedience. And fundamentally, there are two. We would resist the civil authority if ever the civil authority asked us to do something that was a sin or forbade us to do something that God commanded. So these are the basic contours of the limits on our obedience to the state. We would never do something the state ordered if it was a sin, and we would not consent not to do something that was an order from God. These are very relevant. These two principles that constitute the limits of our obedience to the state and guide it are extremely important for us now in this time of the coronavirus, where so many actions have been made, so many orders have been given, often with almost no nuance or explanation with regards to freedom, that many Americans are asking the question about, should I follow this? Do I have to follow this order or that new law? Let me discuss that just a little bit. I want to remind you that the church itself began in civil disobedience. The church, if she had put the demands of the government above the demands of God, would not exist. Just think of the great models and the very fundamental texts in the scriptures. Take the first chapter of the Exodus, the second book of the God-seer Moses. There we see this grotesque figure of a tyrannical Pharaoh. He's being threatened by the rise of the people of God. And what does he do? He orders the Hebrew midwives to kill any and all male children born to the Jewish women. And Shiphrah and Puah are named in chapter 1 of Exodus because they simply refused to obey the godless Pharaoh, and then they lied to his face about why. And God didn't consider it a lie, but an act of virtue These women, when asked by Pharaoh why they weren't killing the men, they said, these Hebrew women are vigorous. They're not like these fat, lazy Egyptian women. They're so vigorous that they have the children before we get there, and so we can't kill the male children. And it says that God blessed Shiphrah and Puah and gave them families. They defended children. They defied an ungodly Pharaoh and his ungodly laws, and they were rewarded with children themselves from the hand of God. That's a fundamental text at the very beginning of Holy Scripture for us. Also, you can think of the apostles and the Acts of the Apostles, especially chapter 4, verse 19. Here's a situation where Peter and John have been arrested. They've been forbidden by the civil authority from preaching the gospel. And they had a very simple response to that. They said, whether it is right in the sight of God to obey men rather than God, you be the judge, but we cannot stop speaking of what we have seen and what we have heard. We will not stop preaching the holy gospel, period. So here we have, in the very early days of the New Testament church, a clear act of civil disobedience, where the law of God is cherished higher than the law of the state, and without question, the holy apostles sent us a model to, without hesitation, always obey God over the state. Of course, the last book of the New Testament, the Apocalypse of St. John, is a powerful indictment of an overreaching, tyrannical, authoritarian Roman Empire, where John is extremely aggressive in his language, describing the state as a vicious and grotesque beast, and also describing the state as a seductress on this hideous, multi-headed monster trying to reduce people away. He was castigating Rome for its use of force and sensual seduction to try to bring believers into conformity. And of course, believers were faced with the question, will they follow the imperial law to worship the emperor, to participate in the cult of emperor worship? And our answer was no, not now, not ever. Nothing you can say will change our minds. And we shed our blood, and the Lord's wrath was poured out upon the godless empire for persecuting Christians in this way. So we have a very solid scriptural base for the practice of principled civil disobedience. Our general disposition towards the state is to obey and to be submitting, seeing God behind all authority, and even bad authority is better than anarchy. Anarchy is the worst, the absolute worst. Besides the church being born in civil disobedience, our own nation, we who are Americans who are watching this video, our own nation was born by a cherishing of freedom and a principled resistance to a tyrannical state. Civil disobedience is how America came into existence and separated itself from the British Empire. The cherishing of freedom is something that our forefathers in this nation have given as a precious patrimony, although I fear it's not appreciated today like it has been in times past. Our founding fathers were very clear that no security is worth anything if it is at a loss of liberty, and that no mature man would ever sell his liberty in order to have a little bit more security. Now, let me take those principles that I've articulated and apply them a little bit to the COVID crisis that we have been living through. In general, at least in my part of the world, I would say that this pandemic, this crisis, and that word rings more significantly in some parts of the country than others. There's many places in the United States, that where the coronavirus has never been a crisis at all. But there are certainly some places where it has been a terrible, terrible crisis, in fact, and death has been at the door. It takes nuance to describe the difference there. But in general, my sense is that there has been a large, unjustified overreach of the civil authority that has progressively over time been scaled back as various authorities, lesser authorities, have pushed back against this general overreach by governors in general. And so that we're kind of finding a settle. There's also a general concern, I think, amongst the populace about the role of government, which has been so unique, telling us how to live, how to move, threatening us with terrible fines, etc., if we don't cooperate. A lot of Americans are asking, will this continue? Is this a precedent? Can this really be confined just to an emergency order? And if so, what are the parameters of the latitude a state has to encroach upon the freedom of her people? This is something there in our system, thank God, because we have multiple layers of government, right? We have the executive branch, a judicial branch, a legislative branch. We have the federal government, we have state government, we have local governments, we have courts, we have numerous forms of law, the U.S. Constitution, of course, being the highest, federal statutes, executive orders, state statutes and state constitutions, as well as local laws, as well as practical government that we see on the ground in our own communities, even the orders of local police forces. All of these are different strata in which law is articulated and enforced, which means that if one aspect of government is abused, we have accountability. We have others that can bring it into order. And in fact, we've been seeing this constantly. Just here in my little world, let me share with you a few very clear acts of civil disobedience and pushback that have helped to try to right the scales. First, our own county sheriff, our Riverside County Sheriff, his name is Chad Bianco, went before our County Board of Supervisors and informed them that he would not obey the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, that his orders were unconstitutional and therefore our sheriff would not obey them. This was an act of principled civil disobedience. Our own county supervisors, we have 5 county supervisors, met and discussed whether or not they would embrace actual civil disobedience themselves. Some counties did in our state. So some of our most northern counties with the smallest numbers of COVID protested and simply disobeyed our governor. Counties like Modoc. This was very encouraging to see. The governor's response was to threaten those counties with a cessation of emergency help and to cut off funds to them. That's how he threatened them. I found that exceedingly ironic, since our governor has disobeyed the law consistently throughout his political career, from ordering same-sex marriage certificates to be given by the city clerk of San Francisco when he was the mayor there, which was clearly a lawless act. He was acting as though he was the law. Of course, all of those thousands of marriages were nullified, a complete waste of time. He did it as a political stunt. To the fact that he has declared our state a sanctuary state. That just means I'm going to disobey the federal government with regards to immigration laws. And when President Trump threatened to cut off emergency aid to California, he thought that was a bestial action and a tyrannical action on the part of the president. Yet that is the very thing that our governor has threatened to the counties that are resisting his imposition of stay-at-home orders. So it's quite a fascinating observation to make. Our county supervisors decided that they would write a letter of protest to the governor and a proposal asking him to change his standards. One of our 5 county supervisors recommended that we enter into civil disobedience against the state government and open, but he did not win the vote, but it was discussed. A third example is here in Southern California. There is Elon Musk, the billionaire businessman and tech giant, publicly called the orders of our California government fascist orders and informed the governor that he was going to open his Alameda factory, his Tesla factory, and that if he was opposed by the government, he would take Tesla right out of the state of California. What do you know? The very next day, the governor of California announced that a good negotiation had taken place between Elon Musk and himself, and they had found a way to make it work so that Tesla can be working. It's very clear when you're dealing with politicians, especially politicians who exercise such tremendous power, that authority and law, especially lawsuits, is a language that they speak. Elon Musk's language worked. Another example of local civil disobedience here in the state of California is a collective, I believe it's called Church Unite, of about 1,000 Protestant churches have agreed to commit an act of civil disobedience against the governor of the state of California and to open their churches with wisdom on the 31st of May. That's a week from this weekend. That is months and months before the governor has said churches will be able to open. He thinks that he can determine when churches can open and not open. This is, of course, an egregious violation of the United States Constitution and the First Amendment of our Bill of Rights. Nonetheless, he has been very firm about this until this local action of these Protestant pastors. And interestingly, this week, our governor came on the television and informed us that he has deep respect for the faith community. That's a terrible phrase, by the way. America is a faith community. Very tiny percent of Americans don't identify with faith. And to call the vast majority who do identify with faith, the faith community is a rather meaningless statement. It's a way to trivialize religion. But that's a discussion for another video. All of a sudden, our governor has come forth and made it clear that he is going to open the churches. They're going to be open soon. A matter of just a few weeks. That is, he floated, I think, June 1st, the day after that the Protestant pastors said that they were going to open. So I say bravo, well done to all my brothers, the Protestant pastors in this state, who courageously entered on a principled civil disobedience. And look at the response. Now we're not talking about November and December for opening the churches, but we're talking about some time in just a matter of days or weeks. That's another example. And also our normal citizens. The governor decided he was going to shut down the beaches of his political opponents. The beaches in Orange County, for instance. Orange County has been a bane in his side because it has resisted his lawlessness with regards to disobeying federal law with regards to immigration. And so he shut down the beaches in Orange County. And what was the response? Hundreds and thousands of those who feel that they can take care of their own health and they can make good judgments about that themselves went out to the beaches in Orange County. These are all examples of the civil disobedience that is erupting. Of course, it's erupting because of an egregious violation of freedom and an imposition of law from our state authorities, from Sacramento, without much nuance. Just imagine this. If you were a governor of a state at a very scary time, which we all acknowledge, especially the early weeks and the first month of this coronavirus, the things that we were hearing were that people were going to be dropping dead everywhere. Our hospitals were going to be completely overrun. It's very understandable that extreme emergency actions would be taken. And we have a lot of grace. We should, as citizens of this country, give a lot of grace to those who were making those decisions and having to revise them as facts and information became more clear. That's true, but imagine if you're the governor and you think it's a good idea to tell churches that are protected from the state by the First Amendment. That's not the 10th Amendment. That's the First Amendment. That the government cannot impede the free exercise of religion. Can you imagine how you should communicate your thought that perhaps churches should be shut down? It's one thing to send a communique to the priests and the bishops of your state and say, dear fellow Californians, we have this terrible threat. With deep I have deep concern for your safety. With all respect of the First Amendment and wanting to be in dialogue with you, it makes sense to me if we would shut the churches down. Can we have a dialogue about this Thursday at such a time, and have the major religious leaders of the state in conference with the governor who wants to take this action so that it's clear that he recognizes the U.S. Constitution as the highest law of the land, and he respects the rights of churches not to be shut down by the government, and that the government has nothing to say with what goes on in the churches and with the free exercise of religion. That did not happen. It didn't happen on a state level, and it didn't happen on a local level. What we got was an order. What we got was a faceless order without personal contact, no nuance, no discussion of the Constitution. And when you govern like that, with that kind of authoritarian mentality, with that kind of deep disrespect for the religious communities that are such the heart of our states in this nation, the result is going to be a lot of bad blood and a lot of pushback. And that's what's happened. And as a result, the DOJ this week sent our governor an order that he must cease and desist his persecution of the churches, his treating the churches unjustly and unconstitutionally, allowing businesses to open up according to different standards of churches. The governor of Oregon had by the Oregon Supreme Court this week, a judge on the Supreme Court of the state of Oregon, nullify all of his executive orders with regards to the shutting of churches. So this is happening over and over again. And forgive me, much of it is a pushback to a very immature and unnuanced approach that has sparked civil disobedience. I encourage all faithful believers always to hold fast to the law of God and never to compromise the law of God in order to accommodate the orders of men. That is a principle that we hold in order to keep our consciences clear, because we are worshipers of the living God and we don't deify men in political power. Christ is risen. God be with you. Thank you for watching this video. Please pray for us and subscribe below, and share this video with your friends and family. Our PNP ministry has more projects than we have resources. Would you consider making a tax-deductible contribution to us today? Thank you, and God's help.